The problems with the Voice to Parliament and Makarrata Commission. In 2017, just after the Uluru Statement from the Heart was made, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull famously rejected the idea of a voice to Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for 3 reasons. The first being that referendums the vast majority of the time fail to get accepted. It's extremely difficult to win a referendum over a controversial issue, and since Federation in 1901, only 8 out of 44 have actually been approved. The second is the fact that only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders will be elected and allowed to elect members, which violates a fundamentally important tenet in our society, racial blindness. And finally, because of how the voice would be perceived as a third chamber of Parliament. But with a new government and new Prime Minister, it's clear a referendum on the voice to Parliament is very likely on the way, and so it should be. It should be put to all Australians to decide its fate. What's important now is that all of the specifics be answered. What the voice to Parliament would look like, how it would function, what powers it would possess, and all of the other relevant questions. So far, however, many of these questions have only been partially answered, if at all. An example of this coming from a senator who was unable to directly answer questions related to the process involving the advertising and creation of a voice to Parliament.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Senator Gallagher. Given today's announcement that the Labor government has appointed a working group on the voice, can the Minister advise the Senate if this working group will confirm the membership of the voice, the selection process for the voice and powers of the voice prior to the proposed referendum?
Minister.
Do you have anything on that? Thank you, President. I think those are matters that the Minister will be dealing with. I understand there is a meeting tomorrow, and those matters are firmly within her areas of responsibility. This will be an important group. I heard. Sorry, it is a very important. Well,
thank you.
I think this is a very important group dealing with an issue around constitutional recognition, a voice to Parliament that is one I think that we should all engage in. There is an opportunity here to do something nation-building, something inclusive, something that wrongs or rights a previous wrong, and a lot of work needs to be done. This Senate has a role to play in that, about listening to different opinions, finding where there is shared agreement to progress this issue that is important to so many Australians, including so many First Nations Australians.
This is obviously concerning given the gravity of changing the Constitution and implementing permanently an advisory body into the Australian government. Naturally, one can't assume too much from a single senator's inability to directly answer pertinent questions. One can, though, understand a significant amount from a consistent inability to describe how it would help other than to say it gives a voice to those who don't have one, i.e. Indigenous Australians. If a voice is something lacking, what was the purpose of ATSIC, the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, the Indigenous Council to the Prime Minister, and what is the purpose of the Minister for Indigenous Affairs? If these advisory bodies and ministerial didn't achieve what they were supposed to, why didn't they, and where is the evidence that what is being proposed will do any better? The Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Linda Burney, mentions in a speech given to Parliament last month that real practical solutions will come forth from this voice should a referendum see a yes majority. What she fails to mention, which is pretty important, are exactly how these real practical solutions will come about and what would separate this advisory body from all its predecessors other than its inclusion in Australia's Constitution.
Minister for Indigenous Australians. How is the Australian government progressing the Uluru Statement from the Heart? What is the way forward on a referendum to enshrine an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice?
I give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for her question and congratulate her on her wonderful speech earlier today. This weekend at the Garma Festival on Yolngu Country, the Prime Minister delivered the most important speech by a Prime Minister on Indigenous affairs since the apology to the stolen generations in 2008. The Prime Minister recommended a simple question to be put to the Australian people in a referendum. Do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? A simple proposition, a question from the heart. As I went around the festival, the sense of excitement was quite overwhelming. Traditional owners from right across Australia looking forward to it with a sense of hope about the future, because they understand that a voice to the Parliament is about both symbolism and practical outcomes. Practical outcomes like education, health, housing and family violence. Because a voice to the Parliament will mean that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders will be consulted and heard on policies that affect them. Practical outcomes that will make a real difference to people's lives.
Dr. Anthony Dillon of Australia's Catholic University has expressed his concern regarding a voice to Parliament, specifically aspects that are divisive in nature and the way in which it appears to separate Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians as fundamentally different. And I tend to agree. If we look at what's being proposed, and even some of the terminology present in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it appears to be the case that First Nations are in fact separate from the Australian government. How else could an official agreement be made unless there were two separate representative bodies of people involved? And furthermore, what does this sentence present in the 2017 statement actually say? It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia. Are Indigenous Australians not people of Australia? I seek not to disparage the Uluru Statement from the Heart, as I believe it comes from a good place and is genuine in nature. But I can't help feeling that it seeks not to include, but to divide. And even though a solution will supposedly come from this, I highly doubt it will be a very fruitful one. There have been some attempts to lay these claims to rest, such as statements from the Prime Minister expressing directly that it will not be a third chamber of Parliament and will be subject to the rulings and decisions set by Parliament. These are obviously necessary components, and it's excellent there's been clarification from the Prime Minister himself. However, when listening to activists, supporters, and even Minister for Indigenous Affairs Linda Burney, the lack of specificity is purposeful and will continue until a referendum has been conducted. This, as already discussed above, is concerning given the fact that the Australian Constitution might be amended to include a race-based advisory body, and that race-based body, as we're being told, will have its nature and structure outlined after the Australian people have voted for it. This brings us to another obvious problem with the voice to Parliament. If it's only advising and making representations on legislation affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, won't that essentially mean all pieces of legislation, given Indigenous Australians are located in every major city and town, in every profession and in every state and locality, when every piece of legislation that even slightly changes something require advisement from the voice? These types of concerns are addressed through the understanding of the nature of such an advisory body, and where can such understanding be discerned if it hasn't been specified, often in debates and through discussions with those on either side. But it appears that such discussions are already being vilified as unnecessary and even racist in nature, as mentioned by Professor Noreen Young of UTS in her appearance on an ABC program a few months ago.
For detail are people who oppose it. So I think there's two very succinct things that you can say about that. One, that it's being railroaded by the Liberal Party because of the rednecks and racists in their own ranks, and two, that there is enormous amounts of detail.
Both the yes and no campaigns are obviously necessary in order to facilitate a national conversation wherein legitimate concerns are identified and addressed and help to avoid a pejorative-filled narrative. This appears not to be a priority, unfortunately, indicating an intolerance of dissenting opinions.
Now we're in the new phase. When do you hope to legislate this question that will be put to the public? And is it possible to go forward to a referendum without public money for a no campaign?
That's a journalist asking the government to dispense with the custom of allocating money to the no campaign because she's worried it might fully inform voters. And it actually got worse, with the ABC painting a very clear picture that if you take issue with the wording of this constitutional amendment, you are immoral and harming Indigenous communities.
Are you worried about a no campaign and the impact that its potential success, obviously referendums are very difficult to pass, may have on your community that has already suffered so much?
What impact might this referendum process have on vulnerable communities, particularly if there is a vocal no campaign?
Yet some are already concerned a no campaign will expose bigoted views and cause further harm to First Nations people.
Community members are already concerned any vote no campaign is going to cause hurt to First Nations people.
Q&A, a popular ABC program that discusses a wide range of issues, held a panel earlier this year to discuss the voice, and did not have a single person who didn't support it amongst the panelists. As with most things, a back and forth is necessary for middle ground to be found and flaws to be identified. With this process impeded, potential issues may go unnoticed. I can understand the sentiment of wanting constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, and I can sympathise. And that appears to be fundamentally what this referendum is actually about. Northern Territory Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price astutely pointed out it's not enough to pay lip service, but to actually act and commit to practical actions. I've yet to see that take place. This is absolutely right. Where is the evidence that practical actions will come about following the constitutional amendment and installation of an advisory body to the Australian Parliament? The Indigenous Affairs Minister stated the following 2 months ago. We can ensure we lift the standard of living for First Nations people in this country, and we can see a referendum come forward for a voice to Parliament to be enshrined in the Constitution. That would be great, but how? And how are those two things supposedly linked, as they're apparently meant to be? As is obvious at this point, I think this particular advisory body is unlikely to help in any major way and violates the racial blindness our society upholds as a fundamental value, and therefore shouldn't be constitutionally enshrined. However, I don't have an issue with a constitutional amendment that states the fact that peoples existed here prior to 1788, the unique culture and set of practices, or for that matter, an advisory body that focuses specifically on issues affecting Indigenous Australians that is not constitutionally enshrined, something we've had a number of times in the past. This brings me to the second part of this article, a proposed Makarrata Commission. For those unfamiliar with the term, the word Makarrata comes from the Yolngu people of northeast Arnhem Land and essentially means peace after a dispute. The proposal, put forth as defined by the 2018 submission by the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition, can basically be surmised as agreement making. These agreements will be between Indigenous Australians and the Commonwealth and will likely focus on 5 specific things related to Indigenous Australians: recording history, preserving culture, empowering communities to take responsibility, creating opportunities, and concluding agreements between governments and Indigenous Australians. There are, however, a number of issues with such a proposal. These include a reduction in the standard of evidence required to make a claim, regard for the importance of narrative and considering harm to reputation, reparation payments, and the idea of forcing someone to apologise for a crime they did not commit to people who were not its primary victims. It's likely with such a proposal that a flexible approach to standards of acceptable evidence will be taking when discussing historical events and their effects. I understand the reality that not all historical events that did actually occur will have overwhelming evidence to support their status as factual. But the issue with this approach is it would be very likely that an even more inaccurate picture will be painted of whatever historical event was being analysed. I certainly believe it's preferable to have a very accurate, partially completed picture as opposed to a slightly accurate and potentially even false, complete picture. This is something that is likely to happen should the standards of evidence become too flexible, and if people are to believe potential falsehoods as historical reality, this isn't likely to bring peace after a dispute. What is meant by having regard for narrative and considering harm to reputation? What narratives and whose reputation? If the aim is to ascertain fact from fiction and bring about peace, isn't the best way forward to focus on the whole truth? I'm not suggesting in the least that narratives and reputations don't matter. I'm merely pointing out that the point of such a commission is to find the truth because historical accuracy is required for the dispute to be properly addressed. Although not explicitly stated, reparations, or even payments of a kind, are worth mentioning as a likely potentiality. How would one determine the value of a particular payment or payments for an individual, family, and group based on a particular historical grievance? I've got no idea. And why only focus on Indigenous Australians if such a path is to be traversed? Many other non-Indigenous Australians suffered. Should their relatives not be compensated? And finally, something I've always taken issue with, an apology by those who did not commit any wrongdoing to those who have not been that wrongdoing's primary victims. It's likely official apologies would be required in some of the settlements determined by the Commission. I take issue with this primarily because the person apologising is taking partial responsibility for something they had nothing to do with. It's almost arrogant to assume you could apologise for something you had nothing to do with, and furthermore, does nothing to actually help redress the wrongdoing. I can understand acknowledging past policies as abhorrent, but I cannot understand apologising for them if you did not support them or weren't even alive when they were in effect. To bring this to a close, I clarify that I agree with the good intent of what's being proposed in both the Voice and the Commission, but the intention of a policy has very little and often nothing to do with its outcomes, which are far more important. And I believe that the outcomes of both are likely not to bring about the intended changes for a variety of reasons, many of which I've just listed above.